For this week's podcast, I'd like for us to look at the topic of Catholic versus Protestant. And while that might be the starting point for our conversation, that may or may not directly categorize this whole conversation. I'll leave that up to you. What would be a better title for this podcast other than Catholic versus Protestant? When I think of the Catholic versus Protestant battle, there's lots of things that come to mind. One of the things comes to my mind. I lived in a little village in Scotland in the 60s and 70s, and there was a war in Northern Ireland that started in the 1960s and went all the way to 1998. That was basically a war, Catholics against the Protestants, Protestants against the Catholics. If you study the monarchy of the United Kingdom, you will also see that there was a lot of conflict going on just between the term Catholic and Protestant. So I'm not quite sure how people that claim to be following the life and lessons of Jesus get so angry with each other that they actually end up in a war. Now, while I don't understand how that happens, I still see that happening all around us. And it's not Catholic versus Protestant, but that same sort of mentality that was in this Catholic versus Protestant battle from the 10th century all the way, well, actually in parts, it still is a huge conflict in parts of some communities even today. So a battle that's been going on, I guess, about 2,000, well, not 2,000 years, but at least 500 years, we will say. But there have been some other issues. So let's just start by talking about the church. Now, the early Christians didn't consider themselves Catholic, didn't consider themselves Protestant. In actuality, the early Christians considered themselves Jewish, and they were practicing their Jewish faith, but the Jews and the people that joined them as followers of the Christ, they accepted Jesus as the Messiah that was foretold in the Jewish religion. So the early days of Christianity, it wasn't a separate religion. It was a sect or a group within the Jewish faith. Now, as things evolved, it became not just a matter of religion, but it also became political. And along with political rivalry and political goals and politics in general, even thousands of years ago and today, kind of the focus on what it's supposed to be about kind of gets lost. So eventually we ended up with, here's the Jewish faith, here's the Christian faith, and in fact, it became a separate religion, and that just kind of evolved. It didn't start out that way, but it's kind of evolved. And some of the Catholic theologians state that the Catholic Church began with Christ. And so, depending who you ask, and the history of the Catholic Church, there are some that say that the Catholic Church is 2,000 years old because it started with Jesus Christ, Christ being the Christ in Christian, and the Christian Church began about 2,000 years ago. And there began to be some fighting even within those groups. And actually, you don't even have to go very far. You can just read in the letters that are attributed to Paul, and you can see where different groups of Christians had disagreements about different things all the way back from the beginning. So it should be of no surprise that there were some conflicts that started about 1,000 years ago and went to about 700 years ago. Depending where you research and read, you'll hear people talk about the Great Schism, and some talk about a schism that occurred 1,000 years ago, and some talk about the Great Schism about 700 years ago. But there was a period about 300 years where within the church, which in our modern day, looking back at history, we're talking about the church. And at that time, we do talk about the Catholic Church, the Church of Jesus Christ. And there was this schism in who had the power, who had the political power, who was really in charge. Can the Church of the West really tell the Church of the East what it is they're supposed to do? Or can the Church of the East tell the Church of the West? And so in that part of the world, we're talking about part of Rome and Greece. Think about all the powers that existed at that time when we're going back from 700 years ago all the way to 2,000 years ago. But so there's all of these conflicts that just happened in history. You can just study the history of the last 2,000 years, and you will see a lot of these conflicts. And religion played a very large role in that. And so I'm not going to get into all the things one group said about the other or what they said was wrong with them. You can study that on your own. That's not the point that I wish to make. Obviously, I have a theology and I have religious doctrines and foundations that I hold to. I think we get very dangerous it gets very dangerous when we say, this is my theology, blah, blah, blah. And anyone who doesn't agree with these steps, just like I know and understand them to be, are wrong and they're all going to hell. It gets very dangerous when we say that. Now, I do have some theological beliefs, and I have some things that I believe to be the truth. But, not long ago, I did a podcast where I talk about God in the box. So when I have my beliefs about God, they fit in the box that I've contained for God. And I can't allow my beliefs to contain God where I say God can't be God to these people because they didn't follow these steps that I have. Now it's kind of like I'm splitting hairs or riding the fence here, but I do know and understand that what I know and understand about God, even within that, I have created this box, and I know that, and I accept that. I have my beliefs, as I'm sure you do. But I have to be very careful that I'm not limiting God so much I'm says, no, God, you can't do that because it doesn't fit my understanding. And sometimes when we're telling other people that they're wrong, what I'm doing then is I'm saying, I know more than God, and so I've contained God here, so nothing that's not here could possibly be God. So, God, you straighten them up. You see where the danger comes? Okay, so we ended up having the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, and sometimes we use the word Greek Orthodox Church, but that's a particular sect in the Orthodox Church movement. And so that in my mind was the first major separation that really wasn't a split, because they still consider themselves the same, but in the things that they disagreed on caused them to be together and separate at the same time. So you have the Catholic Church and then you have the Orthodox Church. Okay? And a lot of that split happened from the year 1000 to the year 1300, and I'm rounding, it's around there. So about 1,000 years ago to about 700 years ago. And there are still some things, even in recent history, there's been with the new Pope and with the leaders of the Orthodox branch of Christianity of the church. It's like in the Catholic Church, you have the one Pope, but in the Orthodox Church, you have groups of leaders. I forget how many there are. I'm thinking 7, but that's just a number that popped in my head because there's lots of 7s when you study religious culture, history, and even the Bible. 7. So I'm thinking 7. It may not be 7. Could be 11, 12. Could be 9. I don't know. But so you have the leader of the Catholic Church, which is the Pope, and then you have the leader of the Orthodox group, or the Orthodox churches, and there's like a group of them or a council of them, and one of them is the leader of that group. Okay, and so we've even recently saw where the new Pope and the leader of the Orthodox Church appear together, and so that's kind of interesting, because here we're talking now from the Great Separation 700 years ago to hear that this church that is thought by some to be the original church, after they got to the place where they weren't considered just um, a separate movement within the Jewish faith. When it gets to the point that, yeah, we technically are a different religion at this point. So at some point. So you've got the Orthodox uh, uh, Church and you got the Catholic Church, who in many ways are one, but are many ways not one. And that in of itself is very complicated. Well, about 200 years after that, which was about 500 years ago, a man named Martin Luther had some things that he did not like about what the church was doing. And in all of that movement, he tried to reform the church from being part of the church. And so Martin Luther, which Lutheranism or the Lutheran Church kind of comes from that, but it actually became more than that. It became a whole separate group of Christian churches that became known as the Protestant Church. And within that word Protestant is the word protest. These were people that were protesting some of the things they did not like about their Catholic or their Catholic and Orthodox churches, some things that they thought were not correct. So they had some disagreements about the way things were done. I'm not going to get into all of the 95 charges that or topics for discussion that Martin Luther wanted to bring up. But this caused a lot of conflict, made a lot of people angry. And quite frankly, when people are angry and trying to get their way, even if you're talking about people that claim to be Christian, we find throughout history that even people who claim to be Christians, when they disagree and argue, they don't act very Christian. I was the recipient of some of that sort of unchristian behavior by someone who claims to be a Christian. Uh, Even a preacher who told me that I was disrespectful to the house of God. And it was like, wow, you are being awfully arrogant and rude and condemning me in a way that is against our beliefs about how we treat and talk to people. That and the fact that he was just clearly wrong. So you have to be careful. And when you get into these religious uh, or conflicts between people who claim to be Christian, you have to be careful that you're not basing your attack on a misconception. Because when you base your attack on a misconception and then you keep escalating your condemnation because of your arrogance and your rudeness, you've lost all credibility. So, in that case, I just shut it down and walked away. I said my piece, and that should have ended it, but this person would not let it end. So, I literally had to walk away and delete all conversation that followed. I do understand that. So, here we've got this man, Martin Luther, who actually made some accusations of the church. He just didn't have some differences of beliefs. He believed they were doing things that were wrong. And so um, the Protestant movement, which became the Lutheran movement, which became a branch of churches called the Lutheran churches, in protest, because of protest, they became the Protestants. The protest was actually separating themselves from the Catholic and Orthodox, or Catholic or Orthodox, but separating themselves from the Catholic Church into this Protestant group. Now, we don't have just Catholics and Lutherans. So the story didn't just end 500 years ago. From within the last 500 years, we've had groups that have had sometimes just, we interpret that different. So God be with you. We're going over here and we're going to practice our Christianity with our slightly different understandings. So that's the way they did that. And that's why now we have hundreds of different denominations. And just like the war that broke out in Northern Ireland while I was living in Scotland just across the sea was basically a Catholics and Protestants who were fighting each other and having a war. A war that started in the 60s and lasted to 1998. But all of the religious battles do not lie just between Catholic and Protestant. Even though the title of this podcast is Catholic versus Protestant, we're really talking about groups of people that call them Christian fighting with other groups of people calling them Christian, and each one telling the other, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're going to hell, you're going to hell. That type of fighting is just not good. And if you find yourself to the place of conflict and you can't move on, do like in the Bible, Paul and John Mark. They disagreed so much that they each had to go their own way and do their ministry, and hopefully continue to pray for each other. Same like the conflict that I had a few days ago. It's just like, no, I'm not having this conflict. You made some accusations based on false assumptions, so you had misinformation, and you're going to attack me. I clarify that your perception is not the reality, but then their attacks got even worse, telling me that I am not respecting the house of God. And it's like, dude, I can't talk to you anymore. You're not even using logic. And so that's the time where it's like, they're still doing this. I'm going over here. And they're still doing this. But for me, that's over. I have removed myself from that, and I won't engage with it anymore because there's no point. That's not the way we do church nowadays. There are whole denominations that will actually, in their services, preach against the other churches and the other denominations. Methodists and Baptists don't always have the nicest things to say about each other. I am a member of a Methodist church here in Houston. And in the last few years, there's been a split within the Methodist church that on the surface is about one particular issue. But the group that chose to split away didn't split away just on that. They made a long list of issues they had. And some of the things they put on there just wasn't true. So when a church is fighting and you give up truth to sow lies, to build your point and make your enemy seem even worse because you're telling lies, there's no foundation of Christianity at all when that happens. And so that's when you just can no longer engage in that sort of thing. I started at the beginning saying, I don't understand how there could be this great war and battle between Catholic and Protestant, or Baptist and Methodist, or Wesleyan holiness, or Calvinism. How can the battle be so great that you're expressing your disagreement in hate and lies that's incompatible with the life and lessons of Jesus? Anytime you engage in that, you're denying Christianity at all. And that's just the way it is. So as we live our life, we have to be very careful that we don't politicize our religion, because politics is about power. And these power plays that play out in our rules and in our politics have to stay out of our religions. And the problem is they don't. Let's jump all the way back to the Israelites and the early Jewish faith. Why did Jesus have to come? Because the people were missing the point. Jesus had to come and clarify. It's not about all these rules. Posting the 10 commandments in every school is not going to fix the problem. Quite frankly, if you need to put on the wall, thou shalt not kill, so that you know you're not supposed to kill someone, wow, the problem's not about whether they are or are not posted on the wall. That's not the issue. So in the very early Israelites and the Jewish people, it was all about the rules. And then when we get to the 11th through the 14th century, 1,000 to 700 years ago, when the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church had their great breakup, it was about rules, really. When Martin Luther came along with his 94 or 95 discussions or things that he wanted to bring up, and he posted them on the church door, He had problems with how things were being done. So there again, it was on procedures and rules. Some of his charges were a little more serious than that. But we're focused on rules and what you can and can't do. The big difference between the Baptist church and the Methodist church is what you can and can't do. Who can be a preacher, who can't be a preacher. The difference between no matter what denomination you pick, they're going to have someone that they believe are completely wrong and messed up. And Jesus came for all people. And our job is to create an inclusive environment where everyone can come and find Jesus. So those that really seek Jesus can find Jesus. And it's all about what Jesus even clarified as the greatest commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your soul, heart, strength, mind, with all that you have. And right paired with that is love your neighbors as yourself. And when you look at how you treat other people, are you loving them as Jesus would have you love them? Are you being confrontational where there needs not be a confrontation? Are you supporting politicians who do things that are not loving and not kind to other people? Are there groups of people that you do not like and you wish would go away? That's incompatible with the life and lessons and teachings of Jesus. Whatever your theology is grounded on, whether I think you're right or whether I think some of your foundations are incorrect, that's not really relevant to our daily life of following the life and lessons of Jesus. If we disagree on what communion is and when it should be administered and how, that doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if I'm right, doesn't matter if you're right. What matters is, are we loving God with our whole beings? And are we showing that we do that because we're loving all people no matter what? We are being kind. We're not smacking them upside the head with 1, 2, 3, or 7 verses out of the Bible and condemning them and telling them they're going to hell. That's not our job. Our job is to walk in such a way that people see Jesus in us, and then they seek that what we want them to find. People don't find something when you threaten them. That's not the way it works. Thank you for watching this podcast. It's kind of an important conversation because this really isn't Catholic versus Protestant. What this really is about, us versus them. And no matter who you are, you're part of an us. And no matter who you are, there's someone that is a them. And you have to be very careful in how you show love to the people that you consider the thems. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. Have a good week.